not about to start.
Yeah.
Is everybody ready? Awesome. Kelly United Gate. Our first contention is defense trade-off. U.S. OCO use harms our cyber defense. First, because of a shortage of cybersecurity workers. Strong 19 writes that systems cannot be protected without skilled cybersecurity staff, but 25% of these jobs are currently vacant. That's as workers are designing attacks for the government. As Todd 19 writes, the DoD has soaked up 70,000 cyber professionals. Second, because of the financial trade-off, as offense and defense come from the same budget. Indeed, Healy writes that the government focus on offense trades off resources. Importantly, RRPD 18 writes that defense is necessary as intellectual property theft is growing, which Junior 08 quantifies is causing the U.S. $250 billion annually, and that small companies are especially at risk because of their inability to protect their trademarks. Our second contention is Russian escalation. U.S. policy on cyber warfare has seen a very recent historic shift. Indeed, Sanger 19 of the New York Times writes that the American strategy has shifted towards offense from defense. For example, the U.S. has placed crippling malware inside the Russian electric grid system at a depth and with an aggressiveness that has never been tried before. Intelligence officers confirm that the U.S. is doing things that we would have never even considered a couple years ago. Valeriano 19 explains that our policy of preemptive offensive cyber warfare risks provoking fear and overreaction in other states and possibly producing conflict spirals, with Ferrante writing 2 weeks ago that the current state of offensive cyber operations continues to escalate to new and dangerous points every single day. Problematically, this aggression increases escalatory action in two ways. First, because we put Russia into a use it or lose it situation. Buchanan writes in his book that escalation is particularly acute in scenarios like cybersecurity, when offense and defense are hard to differentiate, as states have a good reason to fear for the worst. Thus, he concludes that a fearful state is more likely to pursue offensive capabilities as retaliation and deterrence. Thus, Mussington concludes that the possibility that communication and early warning systems may have been infiltrated erodes actors' confidence in their defensive abilities and increases mistrust and the probability of conflict. Russia confirms her willingness to escalate, as Jane reports in 2020 that as U.S. unpredictability and aggression grow, Russia is forced to take precautionary measures. Putin's advisor confirmed that Russia would launch counteractions if the United States followed through on its threats. Second is because of Russian misinterpretation. Anything that happens to the power grid in Russia will escalate to involve the U.S., no matter how involved they were. As Chervich 19 writes, that U.S. targeting Russian power grids ensures that any future disruptions, even spontaneous ones, are seen by Moscow as an unmistakable act of U.S. cyber aggression. Power outages happen all the time. Only one single misinterpretation can cause an escalation of events. Even worse, Beebe writes last month that lines of communication between the U.S. and Russia are all but severed. The impacts are twofold. The first is increased vulnerabilities in the private sector, as increases in retaliatory acts and increased tensions alone lead to more vulnerabilities. As Buchanan writes, the states will need to intrude into networks in advance of tension to enable capabilities, which means that these factors encourage states to set up offensive efforts in advance. Problematically, Slayton 17 of Harvard University explains that offensive operations encourages secretly stockpiling information about problems in the cyber world instead of publicizing it, as countries would be able to use that vulnerability as a weapon. The New York Times confirms that historically, Microsoft vulnerabilities were stockpiled by the U.S., and when hackers obtained these cyber weapons, it caused tens of billions of dollars of damage in the private sector. The second is kinetic harms. Jane writes that the U.S. would retaliate with the greatest consequence if attacked by Russia. A power outage would also be devastating, as Strong 19 says that it would be worse than a nuclear weapon because of deaths from lack of water, food, and medicine. And then Washington Examiner confirms that the U.S. power grid going down will kill 90% of America. Even if Russia doesn't retaliate to our power grid specifically, the U.S. can be forced to retaliate physically with any retaliate intrusion into our networks. As Beebe confirms that intrusion into our system can leave us uncertain whether or not the intrusion was about information gathering or disabling our capabilities, putting the U.S. into an urgent use it or lose it situation as well. Is everyone good? Hattie and I affirm contention 1 is targeting terrorists. U.S. use of offensive cyber operations, or OCOs, helps decrease terrorism in 3 ways. First is increased intelligence. Atkins 13 of the Intelligence and National Security Studies finds that cyber espionage is an extremely viable tool to combat terrorism. Terrorist websites have a number of vulnerabilities. Targeted cyber espionage is cost-effective and produces actionable intelligence. Intelligence can be gathered stealthily by compromising websites that terrorists use to collaborate and trade. Second is combating communications. The military frequently uses OCOs to gain access and shut down terrorist servers and communications to inhibit coordination, making them more vulnerable to attack. For example, National Security Archive 18 finds cyber capabilities were used to interfere with communications from ISIL headquarters in Iraq, forcing ISIL leadership to move to and reveal their backup command posts before kinetic strikes were ordered. Interference with communications inhibits battlefield coordination, allowing military forces to strike while they're disoriented. Third is freezing finances. Harmony 19 of Fifth Domain finds that US OCOs are observing what ISIS is doing online, including suspicious terrorist financing, and making it harder for them to move money across the internet. Comprehensively, Rastin 18 of NPR finds that US cyber operators attack the ISIS material on a server without taking down the civilian material sitting right next to it. Leadership talked about not just ISIS in Syria and Iraq, but how to take down the media operations' entire global network. These attacks work. The fight against ISIS is being waged successfully due to these operations. Chorbach 19 of the PRI quantifies ISIS has lost about 98% of the territory it held in 2015. Not only does this prevent global attacks, but Jamieson 16 of NBC finds that at least 18,802 civilians have been killed in Iraq in ISIS-linked violence in under 2 years, with millions forced from their homes. Contention 2 is a third option. When it seems there's no other way, OCOs present leaders with a third option, something in between going to war and giving up. The best example is Iran. Israel and Iran's relationship changed in 2002 when the inspection of a nuclear power plant revealed more capabilities than Israel expected, and in 2003 with the end of the Iraq War. According to Nader et al. 11, after 2003, Iran unequivocally rose to the top of Israel's national security agenda. That's why in 2003, Scotsman wrote, Israel is prepared to take unilateral military action against Iran if the international community fails to stop development of nuclear weapons. The US found a way out through a cyber operation called Stuxnet. Smeets 18 explains, having the choice to use a cyber capability expands the options available to leaders. The origins of the US cyber war against Iran go back to Bush. Bush often complained that his options regarding Iran looked binary. Let them get the bomb or go to war to stop it. I need a third option. That option emerged. The motivation was to destroy, at least for a while, Iran's nuclear progress. Equally vital was to convince the Israelis that there was a smarter, more elegant way to deal with the Iranian nuclear problem than launching an airstrike that could quickly escalate into war. Offensive cyber operations allow a gray zone of foreign activities, neither war nor peace. CREP 19 concludes, compared with cyber, a conventional or nuclear weapon makes individuals far more willing to use aggressive measures such as strikes and invasion. Sharp 18 continues, cyber operations can produce profound political effects. Stuxnet encouraged the supreme leader of Iran to change policy and restart nuclear negotiations with the West. By saving the region from an Israeli-Iranian conventional war, Stuxnet saved lives. Scott 12 of GMU finds, had Stuxnet been carried out kinetically, it would have resulted in retaliation. This would have caused catastrophe. As Bergman 19 analyzes, military planners ran war games to forecast an Israeli strike. The results were dismal. The Israeli strike dealt only minor setbacks to Iran's nuclear program, and the United States was enmeshed in yet another war in the Middle East. In a conventional war between Israel and Iran, Terrorism 07 of the Center for Strategic and International Studies writes, both sides would seek to inflict the maximum possible casualties. The outcome would be so costly, it is unclear if either nation could reconstitute itself on a pre-war basis, if at all. Thus, we affirm. You want any cards? Are you good for cross? Oh, good. Go for it whenever you're ready. Yeah.
This is a trophy for dogs.
I got 20 pounds. Yeah, this is the most power I've ever held.
Judge ready? Cool. What stops a terrorist from creating another server? What stops a terrorist from creating another server?
They can create another server. The US will just find and hack that too. Can I ask
How long does that take for the United States to find another server?
You can read the evidence. It says we're really efficient at it and we've been super successful in the past.
So,
but then also, the problem is that our evidence is really explicit in saying that the US is able to do all of this very covertly, which means terrorists don't know it's happening.
Wait, you don't,
so they don't
hold on. You don't read a piece of evidence that shows the success rate of these server stuff going on.
Yeah, we do actually. So we read the evidence that says when they like attacked ISIL command posts,
Yes.
they used communication servers to find out
Yes,
where
this is one
exactly.
example, right?
So
I'm
you just said they
asking-
don't provide evidence.
Well, no, I'm just saying like in overall, like how successful has
Yeah,
it
there's
been?
no
The United
success
States.
rate published for that because we don't publish most
Okay,
of our operations.
yeah,
Can I ask you
sure.
a question?
Yeah, of
So
course.
let's talk about your argument about a defense trade-off, right?
Yes.
Like, what is the terminal impact of this argument?
We give you at the end that IP theft, when you see a defense trade-off, both in the private sector and the government sector, you see increase of IP theft because you are able to get past a lot of these, like a lot of like the vulnerabilities. But can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
So on your third link,
Mhm.
like, is ISIS buying guns on the internet or something?
So the argument is that ISIS stores the majority of its funds on the
Okay,
internet. It's
okay,
not
that
really
makes
where
sense.
they
Yeah,
buy
yeah,
things.
okay, yeah. You can have a question.
Cool. So let's talk about Russian escalation, right?
Yes.
So you say that like we're gonna put Russia in a situation, or we have put Russia
Yeah.
in a situation where any shutdown of their grid, they'll blame on the U.S. Right?
That's our second link, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So if the U.S. stops conducting cyber operations, that's still true, right?
No, it's not, because in the United States is no longer doing offensive cyber operations that has malware inside of another person's electric
Well-
grid.
The problem is that the malware's there, right?
I mean, if we're no longer doing offensive cyber operations, we're not going to put the malware there.
Okay, but the malware's already there.
If the United States is no longer, like as a policy, using offensive cyber operations, they're never going to use that malware to kill like the power grids. So Russia knows that there is no threat and that the United States is not doing offensive cyber operations.
Okay, you can ask a question.
Yeah, sure. So on this idea of like intelligence, why does it have to be U.S. intelligence to like fight terrorism?
We just make the argument that U.S. intelligence is effective. You could say other types of intelligence are effective. We'll say two things. One, it's that U.S. intelligence
Yes.
has proven to be a lot better. But two is that we would say like U.S. intelligence is what's been doing the majority of the work. So even if
So-
other countries could do it, they aren't.
So
in order to
if the
win-
United States weren't doing the intelligence, do you think other countries will just be like, no, we're not going to fight terrorism?
I mean, yeah, right. When the U.S. pulled out of Iraq, no one else.
Well, that
stepped
wasn't
in.
because of terrorism. Iraq was a completely different situation where no one supported the United States going to war. I'm talking about terrorism that actually hurts like the countries like around like the Middle East.
We were fighting ISIS in Iraq.
Oh, you're talking about. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's for us.
Is everyone ready? Starting at the top of their first contention, firstly, we would argue that they never isolate for how effective terrorist organizations. They never isolate to you how effective these terrorist organizations are in terms of how effective U.S. cyber operations have been in terms of combating terrorist organizations. This is really important because we don't know to what extent how effective they have been and to what impact they can actually access. And then secondly, we would say is that because of this, we would argue that other countries still have the ability to use cyber operations to combat terrorism. We would argue that the U.S. isn't doing it because there's an international cooperation on ideas like terrorism. There's a united stance in terms of everyone has the incentive to fight terrorism. They would just fill in the gap, use cyber operations, and combat terrorism that way. Thirdly, we would say is that according to Conan in 2015, the terrorist organizations that exist right now is like a very small. The terrorist operations that exist right now are very small scale in the sense that they're happening very discreetly and they're not very detectable. This is really important because they're not really using like these large financial assets or like these large intelligence gathering abilities aren't going to be able to stop these smaller grassroots terrorists. So it's because this is how terrorism exists right now. Fourthly, we would say is that on their communications warrant, we would argue that like it doesn't really matter if the U.S. can shut down some communication. The terrorist organizations can always create new servers. It's not that difficult. But either way, we would still say that we outweigh in a couple of ways. A Russia argument, first of all, if there's a power outage in the United States, we're not going to be using OCOs to stop terrorists, which means that their impact can't happen. It's binary. Secondly, we would say we link in. If there's a power outage in the United States, it's going to have devastating impacts on the global economy, creating more economic damage, creating more of an impetus for terrorism. And thirdly, we'd say we outweigh on sheer magnitude. You have millions of people dying, while they only impacted this 18,000 number. Let's go to their second contention about the third option. They try to allude to in Crossfire, saying that like if we stop cyber operations, then like Russia's not going to be scared of us anymore. But this contention implicitly concedes that we would have malware there in the first place, because we're saying that in the past, had we never used offensive cyber operations, then we would have never then we never would have put malware in the Russian grids. That gives us our offense there. But then furthermore, we would say, is that the Stuxnet thing wasn't even effective. According to Sanger from the New York Times, it was only a very temporary solution in which that, like, it took away 1,000 of Iran's centrifuges of their 5,000, but then they just recovered and built 14,000 more. Then they realized that cyber operations were a really effective way to, they realized that cyber operations was something that the US was doing, which is why they started retaliating and attacking Saudi Arabia's Aramco. On net, there was even more violence, but either way, we would still say that the Israelis never attacked Saudi Arabia, never attacked Iran, not because of the Stuxnet operation. It was because, like, the U.S. would step in with sanctions later, and there was also the idea that, like, the U.S. would step in it with sanctions later. They knew, Israel knew that Iran was never actually going to have, like, a full nuclear capacity. It was very limited from there, which is why they decided to wait on it and let the U.S. use sanctions to prevent them from accessing the technology to get nuclear weapons. But moreover, even if we didn't use that operation, Israel's goal wasn't to use a first strike. Like, they had other ways of dismantling Iran's nuclear progress. For instance, according to the national interest, they hatched a plan to kill all the nuclear scientists. If anything, that's what would have happened instead. There wouldn't have been a first strike. Thirdly, is that this argument isn't exactly, there's still the even if everything they say is true, the probability of first strike still exists right now. That's from the national interest, because Iran is recovering from the nuclear proliferation. The Stuxnet didn't really do anything to stop that from happening in the long term, which is why the risk of a first strike still exists.
Our case, their case.
Is anyone not ready?
Okay. Where is the timer?
The button that says please.
We're good.
/1.
Understood. Okay. Okay. On our first contention about terrorism, the first response they make is that we don't know how effective cyber combat is. We actually make it very clear that it has been effective with every example we give. We explain that we've cut off operations historically, and we've shut down 33 monetary transfers. That's really important because it means that we have had an impact, and we're going to continue to as long as we have offensive cyber operations. The second response is about a united stance around the world. We would say a couple of things. First, they don't provide any evidence as to what countries are going to be involved. We would say we know for sure that the U.S. is involved right now, but secondly, we would say the other countries are definitely insufficient because the U.S. is the one who's taking all this down. We haven't found any evidence about other countries being enough, and our own evidence says the United Kingdom is not doing sufficient actions. That's why we need the United States in place. But then they make this response about terrorist attacks being discreet right now. We would say a couple of things. First, even if they're small, we still have the ability to disrupt them. Secondly, their evidence isn't talking about ISIS. Our evidence is all specific to ISIS, and we would say that ISIS is still pretty coordinated in their attacks. And thirdly, we would say that their evidence says that it's they say that there are low-tech operations. Low-tech operations are inherently easier to hack, so even if they're harder to find once we get them, they're still easier to hack, which means that we still have the same time frame. But then on communication, they say it doesn't matter because they can get new servers. We'd say a couple of things. First, it takes a lot of time to get new servers, and secondly, when we have the servers that we have the ability to hack the servers so that they can't coordinate attack at that point. Even if they get a new server in the long term, we can still hack that one, but in the short term, we can take down their attacks. But then they make a couple of arguments about how they outweigh. And arguments really misunderstand our impact. Our impact isn't just 18,000 deaths in general. 18,000 deaths in 2 years and millions of people displaced. Obviously, the magnitude of displacing a bunch of people across the Middle East is very, very severe. And it harms a lot of people. But then on our second contention about a third option. On the second response from Sanger that says that Iran is building up more centrifuges. A couple of things. First, we'd say it doesn't matter because of mutual deterrence. If Iran wanted to use their nukes, they would have used them by now. But secondly, we'd say there's no impact from the attack. Iran never actually lashed out in a way that hurt anyone else. Clearly, they didn't feel the need to lash out in a meaningful way. And if anything, we still prevented the total destruction of both states, which would have happened if Israel had struck. So that means we still have a net benefit. But then they say that they make this response about how sanctions were the reason for this. A couple of things. First, we would say that no matter what, it still means the United States was preventing Israel from attacking. And one of the ways in which they did this with offensive cyber operations, our evidence is very explicit in saying that offensive cyber operations uniquely prevented Israel's attack. They don't have evidence on their sanctions argument. But then secondly, we would say that as long as we prove that cyber operations are on net good, we're still getting offense on this argument. But then they said that the goal is they could still first strike in the long term, where the goal wasn't to first strike first. Our Scotsman evidence is really explicit, saying Israel was going to first strike because they knew that Iran could not strike them back, and it would have caused total destruction in the long term. But secondly, we would say that their evidence about Israel first striking now is about them first striking unilaterally. We would say there's no probability of them first striking unilaterally, and the U.S. could still get involved to stop it. There's no reason they
would first strike now. But then, on their case, a couple of things. First, on their first contention about defense. First, Chandler writes in 2019 that we will not have a sufficient defense for 5 to 10 years. For the next 5 to 10 years, they want us to remain undefended and that means like we obviously have to have cyber operations because otherwise we're entirely vulnerable to any other country. But then secondly, we said that Palmer writes in 2019, the way to increase defense is also by increasing offense because when you increase support for one, you increase support for the other because they're all in a unified budget of some sorts. That's really important because it means that if you affirm, you're automatically increasing our defense as well. But then Boyd writes in 2019 that we just allocated $9 billion to defense. It's going to defense first and then the extra is going to offense. Obviously, we're prioritizing defense right now, but then we would say that there's a 60% increase in attacks while we were increasing defense at the same time. So obviously defense isn't actually deterring or protecting us from attacks. But then we would say on personnel trade-off, they don't come, their argument isn't that they come from offense. They don't make that very clear. But on escalation, a couple of things. First, turn it against them because Stuxnet writes in 2019, there is no way that offensive cyber operations uniquely trade off with conventional operations. The tensions exist no matter what, but it's the way that we get out our action in terms of the tensions. That's really important because we would say that all their impacts would happen no matter what because we would still have defense that we perceived as offense, or we would have conventional attacks that we perceived as attacks, which means that we would still have tensions with Russia. We would still have all their impacts, but Fitch says that cyber operations is comparatively better because there's never been a single death from cyber operations, and we would say that we're uniquely communicating with Russia really well right now. Reuters writes that we're already having negotiations to tune this all down, and we have a hotline set up for cyber operations, which means there's no risk of miscalculation. In the long term, we would say that on hacking the grid, West writes there's literally impossible to hack the US grid. They have no impact on this because of redundancies in the system, which means that the US can only go down for 2 to 3 hours. Their impact evidence is about North Korea nuking us, not about power grids. It's literally about an EMP attack. They don't have any impact to cyber attacks. That's why we see them happening all the time on our power grid, and there's never been real impact. They go down for hours at a time. No one is hurt.
Can I call for?
Okay.
Which piece of our evidence is about North Korea?
The 90%.
No, it's not.
It's about an EMP attack from North Korea that would detonate a nuke over the US, but it's not really
That's not what our evidence is about. That's probably like maybe if North Korea decimated a nuke over us, maybe it'd kill 90% of the people, but so would a power outage.
No, it's a power outage from that. It's not a nuclear weapon attack. It's an EMP attack that would cause a power outage across the US. That would kill 90% of people because that would be sustained for a long period of time. Your evidence is about a power grid attack that would happen for a few hours, at most a few days. That's not going to kill everyone because it doesn't shut down all of our networks and defenses.
We'll contest that, but do you have a question?
Okay, sure. So let's talk about escalation. So, are there tensions with Russia going to exist no matter what?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Is there always going to be a way that countries are trying to get out these tensions?
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. So would you say that in a world of offensive cyber operations, we probably try to get out our tensions with conventional war?
Is that your term?
I mean, it's part of it, yeah.
Okay, wait, I'm a bit confused about that, yeah. Could you explain it?
Okay, so basically, offensive cyber operations prevent conventional war because there's a trade-off in what the government chooses to do. We've seen this where with Russia, we've been using offensive cyber operations instead of conventional attacks. The same has been true with Iran recently as with North Korea. So what we're saying is that when we don't have as many offensive cyber operations, or we're not prioritizing offensive cyber operations, we're a lot more likely to turn towards conventional weapons because you can see the tensions exist no matter what, and we need a way to get out these tensions.
So why would we conventionally attack Russia?
Because we have these tensions that exist and we need to get them out no matter what.
Just because tensions exist doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to try to get a way to get them out.
I mean, why are we cyber hacking Russia?
Because we want to create a form of mutually assured destruction in the cyber realm.
Wait, if it's mutually assured destruction, doesn't that mean that no one will ever attack?
No, because what the Sherovich evidence says is that Russia is going to misinterpret a spontaneous power grid malfunction as an unmistakable act of US aggression.
Cool. So I'm actually curious about this. So the time frame on cyber attacks is pretty long, right? It takes a while to attribute the attack and build up the code to attack back.
Oh yeah.
And at the same time, we have a hotline set up with Russia to discuss these issues. How is it going to be misinterpreted over time?
So it's really interesting that you mentioned this attribution issue because the US is the only actor with malware in Russia's grids. At least that's what Russia knows of. But there's also the idea that we would argue that a hotline wouldn't really work because of Trump's rhetoric being so aggressive and strong towards Russia, and he's literally threatening we're going to shut down your power.
He's pretty good friends with Putin. They communicate a lot.
But the fact that the U.S. Cyber Command operational sphere is very aggressive towards Russia, and we literally inserted malware into.
But we're not watching.
If we were cooperating with them, we would be like, oh yeah, we trust you. We're not going to insert malware in your grids. But that's a very clear indication.
Okay.
Russia. The first response that they read is a term that talks about an OCO trade-off with conventional weapons. A couple of responses here. One, that the U.S. military is always going to be big regardless, and you have the capacity to do conventional warfare. They don't tell you how you're going to be really decreasing it to a marginal extent that you see like a lack of capacity in war. But secondly, we say that tensions don't necessarily lead to conventional war insofar as there's literally mutually assured destruction. But what Slate tells you, mutually assured destruction because both powers have nukes. But what Slate tells you is that this doesn't apply to cyber weapons because no one actually knows what's going on in the cyber world, and because we give you a specific scenario where we tell you that there's a very likely misinterpretation scenario that's happening. What is our argument? It comes from Sanger, who tells you that the United States is being very aggressive towards Russia and the status quo unprecedentedly for the first time by putting malware into Russia's grids. Russia also has malware into our grids. Why is this important? Because what our Chernovich evidence says that anything spontaneous that happens to our grid, Russia is going to immediately assume that it's the United States, and that's really important because power outages happen all the time, which means that if you buy even at all that something like this can happen, there's a great possibility that Russia is going to cause a war. How is this going to happen? Our Jane evidence says that Russia is going to retaliate to the United States electrical grid, and the Jane evidence also says the United States would be forced to respond, which would cause a power grid outage that would kill millions of people. What are the other responses that they made? The first thing that they say is that OCOs have never been effective. We say this doesn't matter because we say this is a completely different scenario that is a ticking time bomb. Secondly, they say that there's negotiations and hotlines. First of all, if you call for the evidence, it does not say that they have hotlines. It just says that they have some sort of a negotiation. We'd say that our BEAM evidence is that from the same time it tells you that their communication lines are very separate, so this wouldn't work. Secondly, we'd say that because of even if communication efforts exist, because Sanger tells you that there's such aggressive rhetoric from the Trump administration, not just Trump itself, where they're not going to trust the communication, even if the United States says so. So which means that they're going to be forced to respond in a small time frame, which means that Russia is going to use it in a use it or lose it situation. But then they tell you that it's impossible to hack the United States. One, this evidence is literally before Russia hacked into the U.S. grid. But secondly, even if Russia doesn't have the capacity to hack the U.S. grid that well, the United States is going to retaliate to Russia, and that's going to lead to Russian electrical grids that's going to kill millions of people, and that's going to be as bad as a nuclear war. Why does this outweigh all of their impacts that they talk about? First, on terrorism, we say that when you cause power outages, the United States is no longer going to be able to do OCOs on terrorists. But secondly, because when you see the global economy fail, you're going to increase the instability and cause more conflict. On the terrorism argument specifically, they don't understand Kelly's argument where Kelly tells you that other countries can fill in for the United States. The reason why the United States is the primary actor in the status quo is because the United States has taken on that role. Even if the United States disappears, other countries can do the terrorist acts that they're talking about. On the second contention about third option, they don't respond to our Israel response where we say the first strike would never have happened anyways. Israel had other options. Kelly reads a response about how they would have done some weird plan to kill the nuclear scientists and stuff like that. These are things that Israel would have done, not a first strike, because that would hurt them too. Is everyone good?
Where are you starting?
Their piece.
Okay. Please just signpost throughout.
Will do. It's just going to be their C2.
Okay.
The first thing they don't respond to very well is the Sussman term, which says that OCOs trade off with conventional attacks. They don't respond to the actual warranting of this, which is that tensions always exist in these areas and we need to find a way to get those tensions out. They just say we'll never go to conventional war because mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction doesn't prevent conventional war. Nuclear powers have gone to conventional war in the past. That's just not how that works. But I would argue that insofar as what they say is true, which is the US will always have a strong military, absent cyber operations, they would have an incentive to use that military because they have the perception that they would beat other countries, which means that if they didn't have cyber operations, they would be using the military, which means we're still winning that turn, and that outweighs their case because if they use the military, Russia would escalate a lot more, a lot faster, and there's a much higher chance it would get to eventual nuclear war, which has a much greater impact than any of their arguments. But if you go to the line by line, they just say that on the impact defense stuff, they don't really frontline this at all. They just say that the evidence is from before Russia hacked the grid. Yeah, Russia hasn't hacked the grid as in tried to launch the malware. They've put the malware there. Our argument is that the evidence says that there are redundancies in the US grid such that when that malware is launched, the US can recover in 2 to 3 hours. It won't have the impact they were talking about. But the second thing they don't respond to at all is that their 90% evidence is literally about if there were a nuclear attack on power grids from North Korea. Don't let them try to convince you that there's some huge attack that's going to happen. But then they say that Russia has malware in our grid and we have malware in their grid. I'd say if anything, that means that there's mutually assured destruction between the two, which decreases the likelihood of an attack, it's not a place you can vote for them. Go to our case. The place you sign your ballot for us is on our argument about a third option. They extend one response, and it's that Israel wouldn't have struck first anyways. We do respond to that in two ways. It's that firstly, the Smeets card is very explicit that the US knew Israel was considering an attack and intentionally did Stuxnet to stop Israel from attacking. But the second is that the Scott evidence says that Israel was planning to attack unilaterally, and they made that very clear internationally. The argument is really simple. Nader says that Iran is Israel's #1 security concern, which Scotsman says Israel would take action by striking if another country didn't step in. Thankfully, the US stepped in, which is why the Smeets evidence says that the US presented a third option with the Stuxnet operation, which took out a majority of Iran's nukes, but even more importantly, it prevented a real attack from happening, which is important because the Sharp evidence says that it led to nuclear negotiations instead of an attack, and the Scott evidence says if there had been an attack, they would have retaliated, which the Terrorism evidence said would have created tit-for-tat strikes, which would have resulted in both countries trying to inflict the maximum harm on their opponents. A few reasons we outweigh. The first is on severity. I would say that a direct war between Iran and Israel is always going to be a lot more severe than some indirect conflict between the US and Russia that may or may not actually function. But second is on probability, because we know 100% this war did not happen. There's a very low probability that Russia takes out the entirety of the US power grid.
Okay. Y'all ready?
Yeah, go for it.
When has like a superpower like the United States and Russia gone to conventional war with each other? Like when's the last time that happened? Like global hegemons going to war with each other, or powers that have nukes.
I mean, like, what we would say is it's not going to be a full-out war unless it escalates in this story. But we would say there still have been like a lot of forms of escalation. Like Iran and the US have proxy escalation in Saudi Arabia, and we would
So
say
it's a proxy argument now?
it's not necessarily
Okay.
a proxy argument. I'm just talking about escalation conventionally that causes
Yes.
it leads to deaths. We're saying it can manifest in a lot of ways. I'm saying like Russia invaded Ukraine and the Crimea, and that led to like NATO responding, and like
That
that's
didn't
still
lead to war between.
Right,
It's
so
still
yeah,
a war
our,
kind of
so
piece.
our argument isn't that conventional war is the alternative, it's that conventional attacks are.
I know what your argument is. I'm just saying these attacks are never actually going to materialize in war, considering that both countries have an incentive to not lead to nuclear
So
war.
here's the problem with that. The first is that like you could say the same thing about cyber attacks, but the second and more
You
important,
can't say the same thing about
the
cyber
second and
because
more
of what I.
important
Yeah.
is that deaths from war are very, or from conventional conflict are very direct. So even if we just win that there's 1 or 2 strikes, that kills people when those strikes happen, those people die. You have to win this whole link chain where they strike and then they strike back, and then all of a sudden Russia decides it's a good idea to shut off the power of the entire United States.
I don't think that's a bad link chain at all. Like the U.S. cybersecurity director literally
I'm
says
not saying
that
it's
the
a bad
possibility
link chain.
is like high. So I'm not sure. Like I think I would trust like experts over high schoolers on like how probable this scenario. is.
Obviously we're citing authors as well.
No, I know.
We're not just like asserting our beliefs, but
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so let's talk about this argument that Israel wouldn't have struck anyways.
Yes.
What did Israel say they were going to do?
What does your SMEET evidence say word for word? Because I also got those evidence.
The SMEET evidence says word for word.
It doesn't say word for word that Israel would have struck.
That's
it does not
right,
say
because that's not the evidence we read to say.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
Scotsman evidence says, quote, Israel is prepared to take unilateral military action
Yes.
against Iran if the international community fails to stop any development of nuclear weapons, to which the SMEET's evidence adds, equally vital was to convince the Israelis that there was a smarter, more elegant way to deal with the Iranian nuclear problem than launching an airstrike that could quickly escalate into war.
I don't think that interacts with like our ones of what Israel else would have done. Like if they don't have an incentive.
okay, they could have done both. Like what? Then they were just deterred.
They didn't want to go to war, so they didn't want to do a first strike.
Well, no, they like literally were considering a first strike.
Yes.
Our evidence is like pretty
But we
clear
said-
about that. You never proved that your
I think,
argument is
like,
a full alternative.
Hold on. I think like considering something doesn't mean that they actually were going to do it. Like the United States always considers going to like war. For example, we considered striking Iran a couple months ago, but we didn't do it because we
Here's
were
the
like,
thing.
that's really bad for us.
This isn't considering. There's a difference between considering something and being
to, and then back to the case.
I'm sorry, what?
I'm going to start on Russia.
Okay.
Starting with the term they read you, they mishandled Yukio's response. She says that there's known thresholds as to escalation in terms of not becoming really bad. It's never going to go nuclear because of mutually assured destruction. Small conventional conflicts don't have as big of an impact. But the thing with power grids is we say that it's really bad because people don't exactly know how bad it is. There's no threshold for how the escalation is going to work. For instance, like we didn't know how bad a nuclear weapon was until Hiroshima happened. We're saying this exact situation is going to happen in regards to the U.S. power grids. This is really important because the strobe evidence, which it's not the 90% evidence, it's a different piece of evidence. It says that a power grid failure is going to cause millions of people to die because it shuts off like all the energy. It's going to cause massive shortages and it's going to cause economic collapse. How do we link into this though? They say that it's improbable. What we say, the probability comes from a spontaneous attack on a U.S. power grid. We're saying that if there's any spontaneous attack on a power grid, the Shervich evidence says that Russia's automatically going to assume it's an unmistakable act of U.S. aggression. Why is this important? Because Russia has a very short time frame in terms of how they can react. They're going to retaliate against the United States because there aren't communication lines in place, and then that's what's going to cause like power grid shutdowns. They say that like Russia can't like do much to the power grids, but the problem is it doesn't respond to our evidence which says that Russia has already planted malware in our grids that has the ability to shut it down. These grids are all connected to each other because it's on the internet. Their evidence is saying that like Russia won't be able to infiltrate. It's from like a long time ago. We would say is that now they've already planted malware. They have the ability to shut it down. But they're going to keep. They also say that like why would they keep it shut down? But we would say as long as like Russia literally attacked us right back, we're going to have the incentive to keep both grids shut down because this escalation has already happened and they can't recover from it. This outweighs their argument first on magnitude because we say that these two countries in scale are just significantly larger. You're going to cause millions of deaths. But then secondly, we also outweigh probability because they say that like Israel would have launched a first strike. We say that first of all, it's not in their interest to first strike. There's literally other plans they had in order to dismantling Iran's nuclear weapons, like killing rocket scientists. Like this was a legitimate plan that they had. Seriously. It's not dancing.
I'm really glad this is all gonna be on video.
No, I'm not moving.
I'm living for it.
At least I didn't record that round against
Ready whenever
Nick.
you are.
Okay, I'm gonna go our staircase.
Okay. You didn't decide all that time.
Nope. Okay. The place you sign your ballot for us is on our second contention about a third option. What's really critical is not a right that Israel and Iran, when Israel found out Iran was nuclearized in 2003, they decided they needed to take action against Iran because they saw Iran as a threat. That's why our Stuxnet evidence is very explicit when it says that Israel would have launched a strike at Iran if they were going to, launched a strike at Iran if there was not an international intervention that prevented this. That's really important because our Smedes evidence furthers that the U.S. provided the third option. It gave Bush the ability to conduct Stuxnet. And when Stuxnet was conducted, it made Israel come to the negotiating table and do something else other than strikes. That's really critical because if this strike had happened, Scott's rights, this would have had a lot of retaliation, and Bergman writes this strike would have killed basically led to the mutual destruction of both nations because they would have tried to inflict the maximum amount of casualties. The only argument they extend is that Israel would have done something else. First of all, that argument is never implicated to say that Israel would have done that instead of having a strike. There's no reason they couldn't have both. But secondly, Ruby responds to this very clearly when she says that Israel had literally publicized the fact that they were going to strike Iran strike Iran. That's really important because the only intervention that happened came in the form of Stuxnet. Stuxnet prevented that escalation. But even if you don't want to sign your ballot for us there, you can still sign your ballot for us on their case. We extend the Stuxnet turn very clearly where we say the alternative to having offensive cyber operations is having conventional conflict. They say it's never going to happen because countries are going to nuke each other on purpose. Our argument isn't about nuclearization. Our argument is about small attacks and small strikes which directly lead to the loss of lives. That's really important because offensive cyber operations don't actually directly lead to the loss of lives, which means we also have a more direct link to losing lives, which we say are irreversible. But then we would say that they never have any access to this contention insofar as they skirt around a terminal defense on their impact throughout the entire round about power grids not being able to be shut down. They just say without any warrant that power grids are going to be shut down for an indefinite amount of time. That leads to millions of people dying. We would say that only happens if we don't have these redundancies that exist. Our bump evidence is very explicit when it says that redundancies exist that prevent escalation from ever happening in terms of power grids. And we've had a lot of power outages, but they always go up right away. There's no reason this will happen. But finally, recognize they don't respond to the fact that mutually assured destruction exists between these power grids. We have the malware in both power grids. There's no incentive to attack, and there's no reason it would happen accidentally.